Next, we're going to hear from Cliff. Cliff is a nurse he's a rank and file nurse in Minneapolis. And, you know, we originally didn't have Cliff speaking, but we invited him because he, you know, lives in Minneapolis and is, you know, engaged in a real example of the labor movement connecting to the Black Lives Matter movement. And Cliff was involved in organizing other union workers to go to the St. Paul Union Hall and kick the National Guard out. Right now, and they did successfully kick the National Guard out of the St. Paul Union Hall, which is great. You know, there's a lot of and it's created some divisions in the labor movement, which he can talk a little bit about. So Cliff is going to speak a little bit about what happened and how he sees it. So Cliff, go ahead.
Okay. Well, for one, thanks for having me on the panel and for LeftVoice and the other panelists and this sort of thing. I mean, I've been a union activist for about 20 years, and I've never experienced divisions within the labor movement before. So this is all brand new. And actually, that's complete sarcasm. So apologies for my dry delivery about that. But so first of all, I'll introduce myself and kind of my role here in Minneapolis. I'm a rank and file nurse. I've been a union activist really since after the big Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization in 1999. Where we had about 50,000 trade unionists that shut down those meetings there in Seattle. Really, I say that I was politically born in those streets right then. And I was a rank and file activist in the Carpenters Union in Chicago. I'm from Chicago originally, where we built an opposition caucus in there called Carpenters for Rank and File Union that stood for workplace democracy and very bread and butter carpenters issues. And really to recenter the members as the primary decision-making body within the UBC, which anybody in the labor movement knows that the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners and the building trades can tend to be the most right-wing of the unions. That's not new. That dates back to trade union and bullshit going back into the 19th century. So, you know, after the Carpenters Union, I went to nursing school. I've been a nurse for about 14 years. I've worked primarily ER and ICU and have been everything from a steward in local UFCW Local 7 to an elected vice president of the same union on the executive board there in Colorado. Most recently, my family moved from Colorado to Minneapolis in the summer of 2019. You know, among many reasons for wanting to get a little closer to family, to be back in the Midwest, but also because there's a very large, powerful union here known as the Minnesota Nurses Association. And, you know, really arriving in Minneapolis, it was my intention to become a steward and to work my way through a very boring life of rank and file, ground level union activism, and that was it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the day, I was grossly unsuccessful in that. And really that took place around the whole, you know, obviously most of us did not know or anticipate the COVID-19 pandemic that started in, you know, about 6 months after I joined the union and began an emergency room job at United Hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota. So for most of the people in the labor movement that know me here in Minneapolis, it's because of those introductory days where we were fighting for PPE, where we were doing our best to try to build power in the rank and file amidst a pretty checked out labor leadership that was caught completely flat-foot during that pandemic. That did not, you know, that has suffered like enormous attacks on the workforce, you know, stemming from safety standards to staffing, obviously the PPE, and really corporate healthcare running over the labor movement during that crisis. And it was during those first few months that I was identified as a leader in the workplace. We were starting to take some direct actions there at United Hospital. They were spreading from the emergency room to the ICU to the PACU. And I was run through the progressive disciplinary proceedings and was fired from my job in May 8th of 2020. So since then, there's been union arbitration and a whistleblower lawsuit and a big campaign on my defense. So that's really, right now, I'm kind of a sidelined frontline worker. And that also happens to live in the center of South Minneapolis, where a lot of these major protests took place. I was fired 3 weeks before George Floyd was killed. And my family lives about 3/4 of a mile from the now current shell of the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. So, you know, if I moved here trying to avoid historic events, it was probably one of the grossest failures of my life. And I'm happy to have made that mistake today. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit kind of about what's been taking place in Minneapolis, especially leading up to the trial and the verdict of Derek Chauvin in the last couple of weeks. You know, as anybody could see across the country, you know, those protests in Minneapolis broke out of the script for how people are supposed to respond to constant, aggressive, predictable, racist police killings of Black and brown communities for 400 years. And, you know, where the typical NGO layer of the Democratic Party and where, you know, the liberal layer of the union movement has a very prototype way for communities to respond to that. They're going to issue statements, they're going to lobby, they're going to you know, get behind some superficial legislation to convince us that the police can be reined in, that we are sincere about attacking things like racialized poverty and capitalism, and certainly police violence. And what took place last summer was that the community escaped the control of all of those elements that typically have the last word on this sort of thing. And the community took to the street in massive numbers, set the place on fire, figuratively and literally. And it sent the entire liberal wing of the Democratic Party here. We call the Democratic Party in Minnesota the Democratic Farmer Labor Party because it's actually a fusion of the Farmer Labor Party and the Democrats, like way back in the 1930s. Well, for all intents and purposes, it's just the Democratic Party here. And so that sent the entire Democratic Party apparatus into a massive crisis throughout the Twin Cities because, you know, there are elements now weighing in historically and forcefully, as they should, that are not controllable by the political class, even the liberal Democrats. And so, and you know, this all hit into the labor movement like a tidal wave. And, you know, the labor movement itself was unprepared for this. So for those of us that, you know, have some familiarity with it, you know, that the labor movement is not a homogenous being. It is not a monolith. It is really like run by the liberal elements of the Democratic Party, where the labor leadership serves as, it's almost like a proxy government for the Democratic Party. And, you know, but even within the labor movement itself, there are all sorts of rank and file elements, going from radical white folks to radical communities of colors to liberal folks, and then also to, you know, politically conservative working class right-wing folks as well. So in the last week or two, it became obvious that Minneapolis was being turned into an armed encampment. I mean, it was obvious that there was a military plan where we were seeing Humvees and armored personnel carriers, automatic rifles. I believe that most of the National Guard soldiers had live ammunition as well. They were stationed 100 feet from my house. We would talk to them every day. Get to know who they were, get to know their attitude. That was most of what my approach was, is like learning what their thoughts were on this whole process. Not a single one of them I talked to, and these are all 19, 20-year-old kids, mainly from rural Minnesota. Not a single one of them voiced any support for Derek Chauvin. That's not to say that if they get the right order, those live rounds could just as easily be pointed at the same people taking just issue with Derek Chauvin. So it came to our attention just a couple weeks ago that our labor hall was being occupied by about 50 National Guard soldiers and 17 Humvees and armored personnel carriers. This is the St. Paul Labor Center. It is the hall of the St. Paul Regional Labor Federation. For you folks that don't know, this is kind of like the umbrella coalition organization around the labor movement, and they have a hall there in St. Paul. It happens to be just a couple blocks from United Hospital where I used to work. And you know, there was a lot of chatter on social media that night as soon as we found out about this, because a lot of us, you know, obviously we just felt as the labor movement, like, what the fuck are we doing housing the National Guard? Any one of us with any kind of memory of the whole relationship between the National Guard and the labor movement, I mean, this is just, it was beyond, it shocked us, and that they would be housed there. So what we did is we moved very rapidly beyond conversation on social media, and we said, let's just get our ass down there and figure out what's going on. And when we arrived, that's what we found. We found that, you know, 50 troops were holed up in our labor hall with their, you know, feet up on the tables and chilling, and all the armored personnel carriers were outside. We were originally approached by a ranking member of the National Guard, you know, and we tried to figure out how they got into the hall, because we couldn't, you know, normally this would have to go to a vote of the member groups, the member unions. And we learned after a lot of prodding that they'd actually been given the keys to the hall. And I was told this by a St. Paul officer, a policeman. And I said, you got the keys? And he said, well, yeah, but we're like, you know, we'll lock up when we're done. And I said, well, what, is this a fucking keg party? Like, what are we doing here? So, you know, we said, this is completely problematic. None of us gave you permission to come in there. We're all, you know, union members of one degree or another, or from one affiliate, you know, member union or another, and you guys can't be here. So they gave us the name to one of the building trades guys, who gave them the keys to the hall, and we got him on speakerphone, and we, you know, obviously took issue with what was going on. The guy was, you know, really nice. I mean, true Minnesota kind of dude, and actually to the hall, which we didn't expect. In Chicago, I would have expected a building trades guy to tell us to go pound sand and, you know, file a complaint in the complaint box. But this dude came down to the hall and went into the hall where we were not allowed. We were not allowed to get in to talk to the National Guard, state our case, take our objections to them, or give them any context as to why we would disagree with having them there. And within an hour, the National Guard was forced to leave. Now, this was certainly not a standoff between a bunch of unarmed union members and 50 soldiers armed to the teeth. I mean, this was a political win where the pressure of the rank and file forced the union leadership. Well, you have to also keep in mind that it was the pressure of the rank and file being strengthened by the movement of the new black movement all across the Twin Cities, and the authority and the power of that movement bringing into that union, forcing the National Guard to leave. So that was great. It was amazing. I mean, you can watch the video. I live streamed it on my little labor podcast, We Did the Work, and the National Guard left. Well, since that time, the labor movement here in Minnesota has exploded. And what originally took place is that the unions, a lot of the kind of more liberal unions, the teachers union, AFSCME, even Minnesota Nurses Association at that time, were on the side of that the National Guard should not be in our union hall. What then took place is that the right wing mobilized, and I'm talking about the Republican Party, the leaders of the building trades. They took a severe line with this. Obviously, they used our approach to the National Guard. They said that we were disrespectful, which I would beg to differ. Unless the National Guard can collapse by chanting and songs, you know, we were very deliberate about, you know, about our relationship to those working class men and women in uniform, but also their role in Minneapolis. And as of today, the union movement has almost split on this question. And I think that the liberal leadership of the unions that do not want the National Guard in our labor hall, and also have a degree of sympathy and allyship with the Black Lives Matter movement. They have taken a somewhat weak position, seeing now that the right is mobilized. And they have not, not to any formal degree called for any wider discussion amongst the union members or deliberation. They certainly haven't taken a strong and concrete approach to explaining the history of the National Guard to the union members. And this has given a major window for the right wing of the working class to fill and mobilize around. So for myself, this means that in the MNA, in the Minnesota Nurses Association, the loudest voice right now is the conservative union members. And my position on the board of MNA, I've been approached by at least 150 rank and file nurses calling for my resignation from MNA board. Which I have never experienced as a union member in 20 years. These folks are typically married to policemen, or National Guards folks. They do not give a shit whether, my dad was a Vietnam veteran or not. They don't give a shit about the history of the National Guard. And this has gone all the way up to the governor's office, who has weighed in, Tim Walz. And even as last week, the Senate Republicans passed a resolution in the Capitol siding with the National Guard and calling for the expulsion of any union member that was at the labor center from any official capacity in the unions. So this is not lightweight stuff. And we have to mobilize. We have to mobilize fast on this. I'll wrap it up with this. I mean, I'm even being brought up on charges within the MNA. But I think that this is just one of those critical moments where you have true outrage from the community, certainly from the Black and brown communities here, and you've got the right wing exploiting a wedge issue to drive the organized working class away from those communities. It feels a lot like what I remember hearing about or learning about the Vietnam War. And I think that we need to be very judicious about how we approach those union members, how we take our ideas to them, and really to build a new rank and file led labor movement that looks like what the 21st century needs it to be. So I'll just close there. And if anybody has any questions or anything like that, just hit me up. And thanks again for having me on the panel.